Iran is undergoing a demographic crisis. A growing number of Iranians are not getting married and not having kids. It's part of a trend that has alarmed both the religious authorities in Iran and even billionaire business tycoon Elon Musk. Iran is calling for the removal of educational content that may discourage people from having children. Here to help dig deeper into why this is happening is Holly Dagres from the Washington Institute, specializing in Iran and youth. She's also the curator of the newsletter, The Iranis.
It's really a battle of generations. Gen Z, Gen Alpha, as well as they come of age, are really pushing back against the Islamic Republic's norms, and they're really trying to take back their country.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Holly Dagres joins us now. Thank you so much for being here, Holly.
Thank you. It's a real honor.
Holly, let's start by talking about birth rates are declining in Iran. You know, the average family went from 6 to now 3. Iranian officials are saying that by the year 2101 that the population would be down in half. Meanwhile, neighboring countries are experiencing, an explosion in terms of their birth rates. And I was reading this really interesting article online where it talked about this 33-year-old woman named Sahar from Western Iran. And the reporter was asking her why she wasn't married, why she still hadn't had children. And she was saying, well, listen, if I can find a husband, he won't be able to economically support me, or he's going to be a drug addict like the rest of the members of the community. She had dozens of cousins. None of them were married or had children, all in their 30s and 40s. But meantime, you can see that Sahar's mom was married at the age of 14 and started having kids. Like, what a generational difference here. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, when Sahar's talking in that regard, she's thinking, and there's several layers there. First, education in Iran. A lot of Iranians are highly educated. And so that plays a really big role in them forming decisions about marriage and having a family and just life in general. So I think that definitely plays a role. But I think more importantly, young Iranians are increasingly becoming hesitant to get married and have children because of the economic situation. It's very dire in the country, in part because of mismanagement and corruption, and some argue because of U.S. sanctions on the country. But a lot of what Iranians are doing are having to really rethink their future. And of course, I do my research on Nestle Z or Gen Z in Iran. Sahar is more of a millennial, but they are really conscious of what's happening in the world, and with the country like Iran, whose future is really uncertain, they're also thinking about things like climate change. And so young Iranians across the board, men and women, are really having to give a second thought. And I think the World Bank was saying that I think families are now down to 1.6 children per family. So that really, I think, explains why Sahar's thinking the way she is in that example you gave.
So yeah, you talked about inflation, high unemployment. Let's talk about the role of religion or lack thereof when it comes to Islam and Iran.
Yeah, so of course, Iran's run by an Islamic Republic, and so a lot of Iranians have had religion shoved down their throat for 4.5 decades, and that's really played a role in Iranians really pushing back on Islam. And so they've become much more secular. Some have become atheists, some have become converts to Christianity and Buddhism, and it's really also shaped the way they think. And, we were just talking about marriage, for example. Traditionally, Iranians do something called khastagari, marriage proposals. That's become somewhat of a not mainstream thing anymore, to the point that some Iranians are practicing something called izdivaj sefid, which is unheard of in our culture, white marriage. They're basically cohabitating without getting married. And, just that would be unthinkable to our parents' generation. But this is becoming a commonplace practice because there are fears about what it is to be married in a country like Iran because of the lack there of opportunities due to unemployment and inflation.
And what does that say about Iran's future?
Well, it says a lot, and I have to say that the Islamic Republic has certainly taken note. In I believe in 1999 or 2000, Iran actually got an award, a population award from the United Nations because they had brought down their birth rate so much from the years of the revolution. And it was applauded because there was really a concern about the population doubling. But now they're in a situation where they're not really having a population, and so authorities have been cracking down, unfortunately, on contraceptives, whether it be birth control, condoms, and it's really, opened a conversation about family planning and women's rights and their right to choose, and so when you that's one angle of it, but I think the bigger picture is it shows that Iranians really don't see themselves having a future there, and it also plays a role in why we're seeing a big brain drain. Iran has historically always had a brain drain in the country, but in the past few years, I would say since 2017 onwards, we've really seen an uptick in a way we hadn't seen before of Iranians leaving the country for better opportunities because they don't see the opportunities in their country and they don't see themselves having a future in Iran.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's really interesting. And when we go back to the example of Sahar talking about there being, a lot of male drug addicts in her community, can you speak to that phenomenon? And are we seeing that in this new generation as well that you're examining, Gen Z?
So, unfortunately, drug abuse and addiction has been very prevalent in the recent decades. And I think part of it, of course, is because there's, I would say, an endemic of depression in the country because people feel that they cannot meet their economic needs because of the repression that they experience on a day in and day out. A lot of Iranians are turning to things like opium. When I was growing up in Tehran in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about shisha or crystal meth. And so a lot of Iranians are using these drugs to numb themselves, to numb the pain, and it's only gotten worse. I think with the some of the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, party drugs are very prevalent. And of course, alcoholism. Alcoholism has been a big thing. Alcohol is, of course, haram or forbidden in Iran, but there's been for decades now, Iranians have been buying bootleg versions of alcohol, and there's been instances, of course, we've had Western media reports on it as well of alcohol poisoning. But I've also heard that some of these Gen Zers are so desperate for like a hit of alcohol because they become addicted to alcohol that they're purchasing ethanol from a pharmacy and drinking it.
Wow, that's
So
so sad.
it
That's
is.
that's terrible. And when you talk about Gen Z, would you consider how would you characterize Iran as a country? Do you see this as an Islamic country anymore?
Well, 60% of the country is under the age of 35. And when you look at Gen Z, they really stand out from previous generations. And I think I should note that in Iran, they actually don't speak in generational terms, they speak in decades. So they're called Dai Hashtadi or from the 1380s in the Iranian calendar. And this generation really stands out because they're the first to be born with internet and social media and satellite dishes at their fingertips, albeit internet and social media is censored and they have to use circumvention tools to get online. And so this generation has really absorbed what the rest of the world is doing and thinking, be it in how they dress and how they express themselves and even in the lingo, some of the Gen Z lingo in English you hear in America, Iranian Gen Z also speaks it. And you really notice that this is a very different generation because their parents also played a role in their upbringing. Their parents had to live under the most repressive years of the Islamic Republic. And when they had their own children, they wanted to give them more space to grow and express themselves. And so they were allowed to, at least in their home settings, to do things in a way that you and I, had we grown up in Iran, as in the 80s and 90s, we would have had a very different experience than the kids do today. And it's really become a struggle for the Islamic Republic. They actually don't know what to do with these kids. Some of them have, I think the Iranian officials have somewhat given up on Gen Z and shaping them to be what they would call like the perfect Islamic citizen. So they've been actually looking at the next generation, which is Gen Alpha. And so you see this, for example, when they came up with the song Salam Farmande or Salute Commander. You mostly when you see kids singing it, it's Gen Alpha kids that are part of like the regime choirs, and that they're being forced to sing it at schools. And now we also have, Gen Beta, the children that were born in 2025 this year. And so I think they're having to think ahead because really they're struggling, and I think the prime example of how they struggled here was the Women Life Freedom Uprising itself. It was led by Gen Z girls and women, and so, they recognize that there's a problem on their hands right now.
And do you think that they would be able, through that indoctrination that you just spoke of, to be able to form or manipulate this Gen Alpha and Gen Beta?
I think that they're trying to think outside the box. Whether it's going to be successful is another conversation. We've, of course, seen that the IRGC has been playing more with not Islamic motifs, but more nationalistic ones. For instance, they've made a play about the Shahnameh or the Book of Kings. And so they're really trying to tap more into Iranian nationalism, which is much more palatable to the average Iranian, regardless of age these days, than more Islamic motifs. And so they're doing stuff like that. They're looking to musicians and comedians inside the country more. One instance in the past decade was famously rapper Tantalu, who was an underground rapper, and he had been recruited by the RGC to sing pro-regime songs, and he's one of the most famous rappers in the country and is now on death row. But it's stuff like that that they're trying to get more creative and more cultural to tap into the new generations.
And there's this video that went viral. I can't play it out right now because it's in Farsi, but it was basically a reporter inside Iran going up to this Gen Z and showing pictures of um, Khomeini and Khamenei, and they really couldn't tell the difference between the two of them. What is that? What was your reaction actually when you first saw that video?
It didn't surprise me one bit because this generation really has nothing in common with the clerical establishment. They're geriatric and old, and I mean, the fact that they couldn't tell one old bearded man from another apart didn't entirely shock me because they just don't relate to them. But I think it's shocking on the other hand because, Iranian state textbooks teach you about them. Their pictures are in the books. How could you not know? But I think it
Exactly. Yeah, and
just
their
shows
pictures are
too
everywhere.
everywhere, like Big Brother. So it just goes to show they just don't care. They don't care about this regime, that they don't care about the upper echelon of the clerical establishment, and they rather listen to their music. They'd rather dress freely. And in that video, it was actually, I think, state made, and it was basically showing how Gen Z is bad. And, but it was also just a really good example of just how different this generation is from previous ones, and how they just are even openly willing to tell people how they feel when you watch these videos, and that they don't give that something like that I feel like would have gotten somebody reprimanded in, like, the 80s and 90s.
Oh, definitely. In fact, I felt that the journalist asking the question was kind of laughing it off almost, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's just like, so what
Awkward
do we do
awkward feeling,
now?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel that it was intentional, like you said? I mean, their pictures are everywhere, they're in the textbooks. Was that intentional on their part to kinda make a statement, or do they really actually not know the difference? I mean, it's hard
I
to
really
say, but
Yeah, I really can't, explain what the thinking was there, but I mean, we also have instances in America where people come and ask people questions like, "Who's our vice president? Who's our president?" Sometimes, and like people, you can't tell if they're
They really
joking
don't
or
know, yeah.
not. Yeah, and so I just think it just goes to show that people don't really care about in Iran specifically. They don't care about the leadership at the top because they feel that they're not represented by them, and we've really seen that with the Women Life Freedom Uprising, for instance, that the core message of that uprising was they wanted the regime gone, and it was very evident in their chants. And, just to segue back to a little bit about the conversation about Gen Z, I don't know, have you seen The Seed of the Sacred Fig yet?
I've heard of it, yes.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna spoil it, but I highly recommend you watch it and our listeners watch it because those dynamics we're talking about, these generational divides, are playing out in this family as a microcosm, and this story centers around a conservative family in Iran, and you see that the daughters are thinking one way and very different than what the parents think. And of course, the story plays out during Women Life Freedom. But this very conversation you and I are having, Nagar, is exactly what plays out in this movie. And so and it really hints at this generational divide that we're discussing right now.
And is that creating, conflict at all?
Absolutely. It's creating a conflict on so many levels. I imagine it's having, not just within the leadership. I remember when I was doing my initial research about Gen Z in Iran, that one of these IRGC affiliated, magazines before Women Life Freedom was saying, "This generation's really gonna be a struggle. I don't think that the regime's gonna be able to, like, take control of this generation." And I think I can't speak for every family, but I think there's been a lot of, conversations within families about the just, "Oh, well, when I was your age, that's not how my life was." And Gen Z Iranians will be like, "Well, that's what you decided. I don't want this regime. If that's like, you're the ones that put these guys in place, and I'm here to say I didn't want this, and I'm gonna do something about it." And it's kind of the mentality you see across Gen Z globally. Gen Z across the board is very vocal about political issues. Climate change is a very big example of it. They're wanting to take control of their future because they're worried about it. And in Iran, it's no different, but I think it comes with the caveat that they're living under an authoritarian government. And so when they're going out in the streets, they're literally risking their lives because they might be beaten to death by batons or shot to death or end up raped and tortured in prisons in Iran. So there's a whole nother layer there that a Gen Zer in America or Canada isn't experiencing.
And, when you speaking of that, a lot of the young people that were either imprisoned during Women Life Freedom or even the ones that were executed, a lot of them were the sons and daughters of people who supported the revolution.
Yeah. And it's just and that's the irony of it is that, a lot of Iranian conservative families are having these conversations at home right now over the past few years. People that have supported the regime for decades are actually kind of coming to terms and saying, well, this is not what we signed up for. This mismanagement, this corruption, this repression, this dire economic situation we're living in, and this is why we see anti-regime sentiment at an all-time high within the country. And of course we can't measure it, but there's a lot of conversations happening even within conservative families that were traditionally pro-regime about where things are going in the country because of how the Islamic Republic has directed the future of the country, particularly in the past few years.
And it's also in many ways shaping and changing the culture of Iran itself. There was another video that came out a few days ago of a political science professor from Iran itself speaking in Qatar about how Iranians inside Iran are very pro-Israel and pro-Trump.
You'd be surprised at the number of Iranian who hate Palestinian. but I saw it with my own eyes during the past 15 months. The degree of hatred of younger generation of Iranian against Palestinian.
That video was very noteworthy because, as you said, he said that Iranians have become pro-Trump and pro-Israel. And it's because Iranians are so frustrated with the status quo. They want the regime gone, but they're looking and hoping that someone like President Donald Trump, via maximum pressure, or Israel, through perhaps an attack on the country's nuclear facilities, would actually be able to oust this regime somehow or bring it to a collapse. And this is a conversation that isn't surprising to me at all because we've seen in different iterations Iranians talk like this. Even when Iran had attacked Israel and Israel had retaliated, there was some graffiti on the walls in various parts of the country that had said some things along the lines of, Israel hit them, they don't have the guts. Or Israel hit them, they're scared. Like, along those lines were some of the rhetoric, and they're it's because they hate the clerical establishment so much, and they think that this could be a way to help oust them.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then, of course, Israel even has IDF Farsi, where they're actually directly have a channel and a way to speak to the people of Iran itself.
Yes, and, Iranians, I think, over the years, have actually been seeing themselves very much trying to separate themselves from the Islamic Republic. In the 2010s, there was Iran Loves Israel and Israel Loves Iran Facebook pages. And we've also seen that a lot of the chants, Na Gaza, Na Lebanon, Janamon Fadai, Iran, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, our lives for Iran, for instance, is very much saying we don't want the Iranian people's money spent on proxies like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah. And so a lot of the anger from ordinary Iranians is that we're giving money to these groups when it should be spent at home. And so for them, they're taking the opposite side on this issue by becoming pro-Israel.
And And if you look at everything holistically, the declining birth rates, this changing, culture, the lack of religion, Gen Z in general trying to rise up against the Iranian establishment, what do you see in terms of the future of Iran? Like, what is this signal for the future of the establishment in Iran?
Well, we know that reform is dead. I know that some people will say, oh, well, that's been revived through President Masoud Pezeshkian because he's a so-called reformist. And just because he was voted in, which was actually the lowest turnout in the Islamic Republic's 4-decade history for an election, people only voted because they thought he was a better option to say the Jalidis. So um, they just didn't want to create as some people were saying, an Afghanistan or North Korea-like situation in their country by bringing Jalili in. Iranians recognize that reform is dead, and the regime itself is doubling down. It's not actually opening a society. Now, some would argue, well, they're not some 30% of the country, the women are not wearing hijab anymore. That's not a thing where the country is opening up per se. That's just Iranians being defiant because they've been through so much. Because we know for a fact that they have this hijab and chastity bill that they've passed and they've been implementing in different various ways. And Iranian women are still battling it day in and day out with the so-called morality police and ordinary people who are hijab enforcers. So what we're seeing now is a climate where it's really a battle of generations. Gen Z, Gen Alpha, as well as they come of age, are really pushing back against the Islamic Republic's norms, and they're really trying to take back their country. Whether they succeed is another thing, but the way the country is going, inevitably they're gonna win in some shape or form this fight for the country's future, at least in terms of civil liberties. I think that they're really going to have a hard time having to manage 60% of the country when they're not abiding by rules. And so if they don't adapt to that, inevitably, this generation that doesn't want them there is going to somehow push back. And I think you'd agree with me here, women life freedom is not over. It's a movement. And it's playing out day in and day out, whether it's someone like Nobel laureate Nargis Mohammadi chanting it and writing "End Gender Apartheid" on her hand when she's on furlough, or a 16-year-old girl um, with a skateboard and pink hair walking down the street without mandatory hijab. And so I I really think that another uprising is inevitable given the climate Iran is in. Whether it would lead to a collapse of regime is anyone's guess in the future, but, you know, we're in the post-October 7th world, and as an analyst, we have to be humble because everything that's happened since then, no one could predict. And I think that Iran is very much in a precarious condition right now, and the next 4 years will really determine the country's future from many levels.
Hey, that's so fascinating to know that it's the Gen Z behind so much of this.
Very much so, and, that's exactly the message of the Oscar-nominated film, The Seed of the Sacred Fig, so it's
Okay, I'm
not
gonna have
just
to
me saying.
watch it. I heard about it, and I was like,
Yes,
I have to watch this
yes,
now.
I've been raving about it because I'm also like, "Oh, this is like my work in art." So,
It's your thesis.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that's the message it gives at the it gives, and so I don't wanna spoil it, but I think that a lot of Iranians, whether you're a director of a film or a parent in Tehran or a Saghez or wherever, are starting to look to this generation and say, These guys are it. They're the ones that have the potential to do some big changes in this country."
And let's talk about your work and your own personal journey. I mean, you were living in Southern California, but then you spent your formative years in Tehran. Usually it's the reverse. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was probably one of the most consequential experiences of my life. When I moved to Iran, it was 1999, and I had just turned 13, and that's a time for American girls that think about crushes, what's like school dances. And for me, being dropped in Tehran at that time, it was just the beginning of the reformist movement. And I felt, at the time, I honestly hated it living in Iran because I didn't understand. And no one had explained to me, like, why Iran was the way it was and what this Islamic Republic was doing and why was there such anti-American sentiment from the regime. But, being the curious child I was, I asked a lot of questions and I learned so much and I came to fall in love with Iran, and the people and the culture. And it made me really proud to be half Iranian. And so being there during the reformist movement, seeing the country change in terms of how people could express themselves. Of course, this is while living under the Islamic Republic. People were pushing boundaries. And of course, being there during the global war on terror, the post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it really shaped me to be interested in US foreign policy in the Middle East. And when I left, I realized that a lot of people didn't understand Iran. They didn't see it the way I saw it. And so they just saw it through the eyes of the Islamic Republic, the clerics at the top. And so I made it my mission in my career to kind of talk about the Iran that people don't know exists. And I'm very proud to have done that and to continue doing that. So talking about things like Gen Z in Iran, like we're discussing right now, and bringing that to the forefront of conversations and helping people understand that Iranians are not their regime.
And how did that experience form your opinion and your own relationship then with Gen Z? As someone like yourself that spent your formative years in Iran, how do you see those who are right now spending their formative years in Iran right now, too?
So, I, of course, lived with Western privilege in Iran. I had an American passport, but what really kind of also drew me to them was that I saw so much of myself in Gen Z. Being American kid in Tehran, my mom would let me dye my hair pink and blue and red, and Gen Z style is basically 90s, 2000s style, I and I would lip sync and dance in the mirror, and a lot of the things that I see Iranian Gen Z does, they love dyeing their hair the colors of the rainbow. They dress the same way as I did as a teenager, and of course, we didn't have TikTok back then or Instagram Reels, but we had video cameras, and I have videos of me doing very much the same silly stuff that Iranian Gen Z does, like Nika Shah Kanami and, Sarina Esmailzadeh, who were both brutally killed by security forces, these young teenage girls during Women Life Freedom. And so, it really moved me, and it really weighed heavy because I could see so much of myself in these young girls and just the commonalities there, and that, how privileged I was, and but also how they wanted the same ordinary things that kids everywhere wanted. And we talk about Baraya for the sake of by Shervina Hajipour, like, you know, that song really resonated with Iranians because it literally was the most basic of freedoms Iranians were asking for. They wanted to be able to kiss a lover in the streets, to dance, to not have to wear mandatory hijab, and it's really those basic things that ordinary Iranians want. And when I do my work, when I talk about Iranian youth and society, I have to communicate that to people, and when I show visuals of the country, people really see and they say, "Yeah, you're right, they do want the same things we do, and we're so privileged here, and we take it for granted." And so, there is that commonality that it doesn't matter if you're a kid in Iran or a kid in America, you want the same needs. You have the same needs, and you want the same things.
Yeah, universal principles, and we're all a lot more alike than we are different. When it comes to the changing demographics in Iran and Gen Z, is there anything we haven't touched on that you really want people to know that you want to get out there?
Well, I think that when we talk about Gen Z, I don't wanna paint them as a broad brush as all of Gen Z is anti-regime. There is a pro-regime component, and they do exist. They're, of course, smaller in numbers because Iran is going in a direction where majority Iranians have become anti-regime across the board, but they do exist. They're the new recruits for the IRGC, they're the new recruits for the Basij or the police, security forces. So they very much exist, and I don't wanna make it seem like I'm saying every Gen Zer is fitting into one box, but, that number is obviously becoming increasingly smaller because Gen Z is a very much a curious generation. They like to do their own research, and because of, like I said, internet and social media, they're interacting and engaging in different ways they didn't before, and so it's opening their eyes. So even if now they have those feelings, maybe years down the line, those feelings might change about the regime itself.
Thank you so much, Holly. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. This was great.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.